as many as we can. So it's an enormous pleasure. If you haven't heard Richard speak before, I'm sure you will thoroughly enjoy it. It's a huge pleasure to introduce Richard Burgon MP to you. He was on the show under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. He's Secretary of the Socialist Campaign Group of MPs, and I'm sure he's going to give us a very interesting speech this evening. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Great to be here this evening. I've had a wonderful tour, and it's wonderful to be joined by people tonight, both here and online as well. We meet 50 years and one day since the publication of Labour's programme for 1973, and I'm pleased to have been invited here to give this lecture on Tony Benn and Labour's 1973 to 74 programme for an irreversible shift of wealth and power in favour of working people. Today, in 2023, under an unpopular Conservative government, people face the biggest class living standards in living memory. They face a crisis in relation to their wages, our public services and housing. Energy and food prices have gone through the roof. Trade unions have been fighting back for fair wages as prices spiral, and in the context of draconian anti-trade union legislation. There are significant similarities with the situation people faced back in the early 1970s that led Harold Wilson in the 1974 February General Election Manifesto introduction to say, of interlocking crises. Prices are rocketing. The Tories have brought the country to the edge of bankruptcy and breakdown. More and more people are losing their jobs. Firms are going out of business. Housing costs are out of reach for so many families. That manifesto was the product of a document, as I say, launched 50 years ago this week. On the 7th of June, 1973, Labour's programme for 1973 in the context of an upsurge in left ideas and left organisation and trade union militancy during a period of crisis. That programme, as I'll explain in this lecture, offered bold policy proposals as solutions to that crisis, from wealth taxes to public ownership of new energy sources and price controls on essentials to protect working people. These ideas not only formed the bases of the manifesto that saw Labour win the general election of February 1974, but they continue to be of enduring relevance today, offering a vision for how we can overcome the multiple crises our society now faces in a way that serves the vast majority of people, the 99%. Before looking the content of that programme, however, I want to look at how it came about, specifically the rise of trade union militancy and the impact this had on the Labour Party, and how, in the words of one historian, as the party of the trade union movement, Labour could not escape to ferment in the rank and file in the early 70s. The 1970s began with the unexpected election of the Conservatives under Edward Heath, who defeated Harold Wilson. Heath quickly introduced a piece of legislation, the 1971 Industrial Relations Act, that shook up and transformed the Labour movement over the rest of that decade as a groundswell of resistance emerged to its implementation. The radicalisations saw bold attempts at workers' control, for example, with the 1971 work-in at the Upper Clyde shipyard in response to the Tory government's attempt to close down the yards and throw the workers on the industrial scrap heap. That movement, led by Jimmy Reid, to stage a work-in rather than go on strike or stage a sit-in, caught the imagination of people in the Labour movement, including, as we will see later, Tony Benn. Then, in 1972, the National Union of Mine Workers undertook a successful national strike that defeated the Conservative government, and with the Battle of Saltley Gates brought Arthur Scargill to national prominence, and this victory opened up a decade of working class radicalism. This is the ferment that was happening as the Labour Party sought to address its 1970 defeat. Labour's programme for 1973, in the words of Stuart Holland, the economist who was key to its economic programme and who in 1979 became a Labour MP, and these are his words, represented the culmination of major pressure from the Labour movement for a rethinking of the nature of socialist policy in government, stemming from the first party conference following the 1970 election defeat. Geoffrey Foote, in his book, The Labour Party's Political Thought, A History, put the development of Labour's programme for 1973 into context as follows, talking of the left as being on the offensive, writing that, and it's worth quoting at length, the corporatist, undemocratic nature of British society was the main object of attack for the Labour left in the 1970s. However, where the new left were highly suspicious of Labour as a parliamentary party, hostile to extra-parliamentary activity, the new Labour left saw no reason why parliamentary and extra-parliamentary activity could not go hand in hand. The assertion by Ralph Miliband that Labour was too immersed in parliamentary practice to support action by the Labour movement was disproved in practice, as Tony Benn marched arm in arm with the Upper Clyde shipbuilders workers, and as the Institute of Workers' Control reminded Labour that it had a tradition older than the Morrisonian and Fabian stress on the expert. The criticisms of the Labour Party were nullified as Miliband's call for a broader strategy of action was integrated into Labour thinking. As the party of the trade union movement, Labour could not escape the ferment in the rank and file in the early 1970s. The passage of the Industrial Relations Act in 1971 and Britain's entry into the common market in 1973 served as a focus for the left to urge their rejection of corporatism on the Labour leadership. One of the emerging leaders of the Labour left, Eric Heffer, urged Labour to return to its working class origins. In the class struggle in Parliament, 1973, Heffer pointed to the trade union base of the Labour Party as the reason why there could be no other party of the working class. If Labour remained true to the first principles of defending that class, then its radical potential could not be lost. These principles, enunciated in the ideas of British socialism at the turn of the century, were embodied in Labour's programme 1973, adopted at that year's party conference, calling for an extension of public ownership and a measure of industrial democracy. That programme stated Labour's main aim was to bring about a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people and their families. A long quote, I know, from Geoffrey Foote, but very much worth reading in totality because it puts into context the situation that faced the labour and trade union movements and indeed the country. So there was a radical shift in the immediate years following Labour's 1970 electoral defeat. Tony Benn was key to the development of this 1973 programme and its later expression as a successful manifesto. Benn, who, like Labour's programme, moved to the left in his analysis and proposals during this period as a result of how his ideas were shaped by his frustrating experiences in governments and by the wider social ferment taking place, for example, as I mentioned, with the Upper Clyde shipbuilders' occupation and working and wider trade union militancy, particularly the National Union of Mine Workers. It's easy these days to forget that earlier in his parliamentary career, Tony Benn had backed Hugh Gateskill for Labour leader over Nye Bevan and had spoken in favour of Gateskill's failed attempt to scrap Labour's Clause 4 committed to public ownership. But by the 1970s, influenced by his own experiences with an obstructive senior civil service establishment, his disappointment at the 1960s Labour government not delivering on the party's programme, and the radical industrial, political and intellectual context of the time, Tony Benn had come to a socialist analysis and achieved a determined advocacy of that analysis, which meant that he was becoming the in Parliament of a new left in the wider party and in the country. Benn believed Keynesian consensus and managed welfare state economy, which had been successful but had entered crisis by the 1970s, had come to an end. The alternative he pursued to this was a democratic socialist programme based upon public investment, public ownership, and with self-management in the workplace. So what was the 1973 programme? The 1973 programme opened the big and unapologetic vision for a better society, stating as follows: "We are a democratic socialist party and proud of it. We put the principles of democracy and socialism above consideration of privilege and market economics. We aim to bring about a society and cooperation instead of competition, where production is for people's needs, not for private profits, where community care is available for all, where personal relationships are based on equality and international relationships on mutual respect." That opening line echoes of the 1945 Labour Party manifesto, which stated the Labour Party is a socialist party and proud of it, going on to state that its ultimate purpose at home is the establishment of the socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain, free, democratic, efficient, progressive, public-spirited, its material resources organised in the service of the British people. This programme from 1973 aimed to secure change as transformative and as epoch-defining as the programme of the 1945 Labour government, which of course created the National Health Service, built the welfare state and embarked upon a bold programme of nationalisation. The 122-page programme for 1973 famously stated that its goal was to bring about a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of work. A phrase echoed in recent years when, as socialists, we've talked about the need to bring about a fundamental and irreversible shift in power, wealth and control. So the programme went on to set out the following further headline aims, and I quote: "To make power fully accountable to the community, to workers and to the consumer, to eliminate poverty wherever it exists, to achieve far greater economic equality in our society, in income, in wealth, and in the living standards of everyone, to increase social equality by a substantial shift in the emphasis now put on job creation, housing, education, and social benefits, to improve the environment so that the workplace is more comfortable, our cities more inviting, and the air and water around us cleaner." It's both inspiring, but also in some ways dispiriting to consider the similarities with the challenges facing 10, 50 years ago, and inspiring because of its enduring relevance and the enduring relevance of those policies, dispiriting in some ways because it reminds us of Tony Benn's maxim that really you have to fight the same battles again and again and again. And of course, this programme for 1973 was formally launched at the Labour Party conference in Blackpool in 1973. Harold Wilson opened and Tony Benn closed the conference debate on public ownership. A passage from Tony Benn's closing speech in that debate explains how Labour's radical programme had come about, but it also reflects, I would argue in some ways, part of how his political journey leftwards had come about too. Benn told the Labour conference, "We shall not change the power structure in our society solely by conference resolutions, by cabinet decisions or by parliamentary legislation. Historically, all pressure for social change and improvement has begun outside Parliament, as indeed the history of the Labour movement itself proves. The trade unions, the Trades Union Congress, the Labour Representation Committee, Labour Members of Parliament, Labour governments, Acts of Parliament are the last and never the first stage in the process of political and economic reform. This reflects Geoffrey Foot's analysis I quoted earlier about the effects of the trade union struggles on the Labour Party itself and on the Labour Party's programme. The phrase that's most remembered from Benn's closing speech at the 1973 Blackpool Conference came towards the end of his speech. Benn addressed various points that the speakers and delegates had made in the debate and commented as follows. One delegate said that we should inherit a crisis when we come to power. Everyone knows that, and certainly the spending priorities will have to be determined in the light of what we can do. We cannot do anything about that, but the question we are answering today is a different and important question in respect of our industrial policy. And let me spell it out clearly so that nobody is in any doubt whatsoever about what we are saying. We are saying at this conference that the crisis that we will inherit when we come to power will be the occasion for fundamental change and not the excuse for postponing it. That is what we are saying in this debate today. The crisis we will inherit when we come to power will be the occasion for fundamental change and not the excuse for postponing it. This statement, this analysis, remains a challenge and a test to us today as much as it was back in 1970. Tony Benn's speech to the party conference that day is worth looking at in greater detail in order to understand the political and economic framework in which Labour's programme for 1973 was situated. Amongst Tony Benn's defining interests were democracy and power, and he saw the need for public ownership through this prism as he looked at the way the economy and, as a result, democracy, or the real lack of it, and power was changing. In his speech, he explained that our policy on public ownership is based upon a serious analysis of the developing power structure in our society. Fewer, larger companies, many of them multinational, growing larger and more powerful. And we know, we must say, that if we do not control and own us, and that is a challenge that we face. And he made the link between public ownership and wider issues even more clear, going on to say it's not just a matter of efficiency, it's not just a matter of investment, it's not just a matter of regional policy, it's a matter of political power. For if this political expression of unaccountable economic power is allowed to continue, our political democracy too will be reduced to a fiction, and that is what matters about the programme we bring forward. As we meet today and see the fate of so many millions determined by multinational corporations, how relevant and how true were the words of speech over 50 years ago. Early on in his speech, he said that this debate on our programme and the reception given to Harold in presenting it proves that the 3 years hard work that's been done within the movement as well as on the executive and in the House of Commons has produced a policy that does more than meet the demands of the movement for an expansion of public ownership. It meets the deep needs of the people of this country as they turn to others for protection from the abuse of business power to which they are now exposed. And those who talk about public ownership as if in some way it represented a threat had better realise the truth, which is that there are millions of workers, and I mean workers, right up to management level, who are much more frightened today of the possibility that Slater Walker will take them over and sell our assets and close them down than of anything. In his diary entry for that day, Tuesday, the 2nd of October, 1973, Benn recorded that my winding up went down well and the conference responded marvellously. People latched onto the phrase, we shall use the crisis we inherit as an occasion for making the fundamental changes and not as an excuse for postponing them. This pledge will be the test of sincerity of the next Labour government. And the next Labour government came around quickly. The Tories called a snap general election in February 1974 with an anti-trade union message, putting the question to the country, who governs Britain? The answer was a resounding, not you, Heath, as Labour won. Not a single newspaper supported Labour in the general election. I think someone's going to correct me and refer to the Morning Star, but not a single newspaper with wider circulation supported Labour in the general election. It was, as Tony Benn had set out and predicted in his speech to Labour Party conference on public ownership, when he said, "Moreover, the violence of the attacks on our public ownership plans and on us for defending them, launched by big business and by the media, confirm our judgment that these plans are a serious threat, as they are intended to be, to the unaccountable power they wield and the unacceptable privileges that they defend with that power. We must mean what we say and say what we mean, and not run for cover when Fleet Street turns upon us. Because I must say this quite seriously to this conference, that if it looks tough now, it is as nothing to the roaring attack that will descend upon us as we seek and mean to carry through this programme." So despite this lack of newspaper support, despite the ferocity of establishment attacks, and despite the paranoia within key sections of the state in relation to Wilson, Benn and the Labour programme, Labour came out of the February 1974 general election as the largest party, and Harold Wilson was Prime Minister again. And of course, an outright Labour majority was won in October 1974 at that election. Considering then Labour leader Harold Wilson's forward to the 1974 Labour Party manifesto, which emerged from Labour's programme of 1973, the similarities between the challenges people face now in 2023 and the challenges people faced back then couldn't be clearer. As I mentioned earlier in my remarks, Wilson stated, "Our people face a series of interlocking crises. Prices are rocketing. The Tories have brought the country to the edge of bankruptcy and breakdown. More and more people are losing their jobs. Firms are going out of business. Housing costs are out of reach for so many families." A situation that people can identify with today. The 1974 manifesto itself opened up by setting out the scale of the crisis, stating, "Britain needs a new government, and the Labour Party is ready with the policies essential to rescue the nation from the most serious political and economic crisis since 1945. His comments in his conference speech that the crisis that we will inherit when we come to power is occasion for fundamental change and not the excuse for postponing it, when it talked about the Tory legacy, stating that the longer the Conservative government survives, the more desperate the situation a Labour government will inherit. The graver our economic situation, the more important it will be to protect the poorer members of the community, such as the pensioners, by a drastic redistribution of wealth and income. However, the nature of the crisis will require that the structural changes we propose should be made even more urgently. Now, this idea has clear relevance to the debate now taking place about whether or can be relied upon to yield the resources to rescue our public services and lift living standards after 13 years of Tory attacks. It reminds us that whatever the levels of economic growth, the Labour needs to deliver a fundamental shift in the grotesque levels of inequality scarring our society if we are to tackle the crises that people face. Practice of those times, the 1974 manifesto set out main specific policies such as oil and gas resources being brought into full public ownership, with the manifesto stating, "We cannot accept that the allocation of world output should continue to be made by multinational oil companies and not by governments." This reflected the analysis that Tony Benn outlined in an article he wrote in the Times in December 1973, in which he wrote that the whole economy will need to be reshaped around energy considerations. This task can no more be tackled by free enterprise, even with the government intervention on the present scale, than we could undertake a big rearmament programme by shopping around from competing business firms. This was part of a wider vision in the manifesto for public ownership that went beyond the top-down corporatist nationalisations of the 1940s onwards. The manifesto had a commitment to taking into common ownership land required for development, and as well as bringing various other industries into public ownership, It then says, and this is key, but we shall not confine the extension of the public sector to the loss-making and subsidised industries. We shall also take over profitable sections or individual firms in those industries where a public holding it is essential to enable the government to control prices, stimulate investment, encourage exports, create employment, protect workers and consumers from the activities of irresponsible multinational companies, and supplant the national economy in the national interest. This is, as Tony Benn said in his closing speech in the public ownership debate at the previous year's Labour Party conference, where he remarked, "When we are sent back to power, as I believe we surely shall be, we are ready to give instructions for the completion of the industry bill, with the powers contained within it to establish the National Enterprise Board, not to be an ambulance for lame ducks, but to move in the area of profitable manufacturing industry, which is at the heart of that proposal." The 1974 manifesto talks about democratising national industries, stating we intend to socialise existing nationalised industries. In consultation with the unions, we shall take steps to make the management of existing nationalised industries more responsive to the workers in the industry and more responsive to their consumers' needs. Again, this understanding that the nationalised models of the great 1945 Labour government weren't enough very much echoes Tony Benn's speech to the 73 party conference, where he said, "We reject as a party and a movement the idea that one worker on the board is industrial democracy. We reject co-ownership. We reject the phony works council, not rooted in the strength and structure and traditions of the trade union movement. All these are window dressing, designed to divert the demand for democratic control into utterly harmless challenge. We are talking about the transfer of power within industry. We will not accept the existing pattern of nationalisation as a form for the future. We have enough experience now, surely, to know that nationalisation plus Lord Robbins does not add up to socialism, and that is a message that we're sending out." In terms of other policies in the manifesto, beyond public ownership, the manifesto also committed to introduce strict price controls on key services and commodities, to limiting rent increases and protecting tenants from eviction. It called for the redistribution of income and wealth, stating, "We shall introduce an annual wealth tax on the rich, bring in a new tax on major transfers of personal wealth, heavily tax speculation in property, including a new tax on property companies, and seek to eliminate tax dodging across the whole field." Committed to repealing the Anti-Trade Union Industrial Relations Act. The 1974 manifesto also committed to revise and expand the National Health Service, abolish prescription charges, introduce free family planning, phase out private practice from the hospital service, and transform the area health authorities into democratic bodies. And it committed to large-scale investment in railways, tubes and buses, and a fares policy which puts the needs of the travelling public first. Of course, this was before the Tories privatised the railways and the buses. And that manifesto closes with the bold and wide-ranging affirmation that, and I quote, "It is indeed our intention to bring about a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people and their families, eliminate poverty wherever it exists in Britain, and commit ourselves to a substantial increase in our contribution to fight poverty abroad, make industry genuinely accountable to the workers and the community at large, achieve far greater economic equality in income, wealth and living standards, increase social equality by giving far greater importance to full employment, housing, education and social benefits, and improve the environment in which our people live and work and spend their leisure." Undoubtedly an excellent progressive programme, developed in the context of an economic crisis and influenced by a period of fight back from the trade unions. It's useful to reflect upon how this programme, which led to 2 general election victories, came about. It wasn't the product of Labour politicians, even left Labour politicians in a vacuum. It was the product of a period of working class struggle through the trade unions, which led to re-examination of how the economy worked and in whose interests, and how democracy, public ownership and progressive economic policies were more necessary than ever as multinational corporations grew in size, strength and power. A progressive winning programme as a result of trade union and wider social struggle and the advance of left ideas in a period of deep crises can give us, as a movement, hope as we today look to the future. Now, the story of how and why this whole manifesto and the 1973 programme upon which it was based was not fully implemented, and the fallout of that, including the spurring of a new movement in the party demanding grassroots power, including the formation of the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, all of that warrants a whole lecture on its own. But what must be said tonight is that the results of the programme not being fully implemented and delivered upon was not a return to a relatively benign status quo or a business as usual. It was instead the imposition, the economic shock therapy of Thatcherism, inspired by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, a free market fundamentalism which saw privatisation across the board, deindustrialisation, draconian attacks on the trade union movement, and soaring unemployment and inequality. A lesson is that in the time of crisis, without the implementation of progressive policies sufficient to meet the scale of the crisis, alternative reactionary ideas will step into the breach. That is, during a crisis, the status quo won't hold. And so the fundamental question becomes, what is our party offering to wider society as solutions to the crisis? All of this offers great food for thought for our movement today. Of course, key tenets of the alternative economic strategy didn't lose their relevance when they were not implemented in the 1970s. Indeed, they retain great relevance for the challenges we face as a society today when it comes to the need for a wealth tax, for greater employment rights, for greater empowerment of our trade unions, for public ownership, including in relation to energy. And as neoliberalism set in, destroying communities as well as industries, and for decades to come, Tony Benn pushed and developed the ideas of the early 1970s, updating them for the challenges of the day. And in the aftermath, the IMF imposed cuts of 1976 into his alternative economic strategy that advocated an alternative economic model that didn't just serve the interests of the majority of people, but was run by them too. Struggle for Labour's programme of 1973 really marked the key points in the transformation of Tony Benn into the left leader whose ideas still, even following his passing in 2014, has so much influence today. Tony Benn, throughout his life, identified a number of shortcomings in the British and world capitalist economy throughout his life, and his concerns remain as relevant as ever. Benn, his attitude regarding the Labour Party's economic and social role, when he said, "We are not here just to manage capitalism, but to change society and to define its finer values." Moving on, 1973 programme, Benn session and subsequent IMF blackmail of the Labour government in 1976 was an important crossroads. At this point that a Labour government opted to cut expenditure and sideline trade union demands in lines with the IMF's recipe, instead of pursuing the kinds of policies outlined in the 1973 programme and 1974 manifesto. As I mentioned, Thatcher then won the 1979 general election as the most strident advocate of the new neoliberal agenda advocated by the IMF. Principles. The alternative economic strategy developed by Tony Benn in Labour's programme and further developed and applied to developing circumstances and challenges in the subsequent decades, greatly influenced Labour's economic policy in its 2017 General Election Manifesto for the many, not the few, an election which, whilst we sadly did not win, saw 6 years ago today the largest swing to Labour since the 1945 general election, a gain of some 3 million votes, and Labour's only electoral advance in a general election for 20 years. It was such a shame that Tony Benn wasn't around to be part of that and to provide the advice and support that he no doubt would have, given his many decades of political experience, including in high levels of government. When one considers the situation we have today, the study of the relevance of Labour's 1973 programme and 1974 manifesto, its development and the consequences of it not being fully implemented is clear to see. Let's just look at the questions of ownership, wealth and inequality, for example. Inequality in our society, as we meet today, is truly shocking. In terms of land, half of England is owned by less than 1% of the population. A book released in 2020 by Guy Shrubsole called Who Owns England shone new light on land inequality for the first time by looking at the land registry. Doing this showed that half of England is owned by less than 1% of the population. In a country of nearly 70 million people, just 25,000 landowners, typically members of the aristocracy and corporations, have control of half of the country. Aristocrats who own 30% of the land and corporations that own 17% of the land are the biggest landowners. In contrast, those who own homes in England own only 5% of the country, just 5%. Most people remain unaware of how much land is owned by so few. This dramatic concentration of land ownership is an inescapable reminder that ours currently is a country for the few and not the many. Why should aristocrats whose families have owned the same areas of land for centuries and large corporations exercise more influence over local neighbourhoods than the people who actually live there? It's clear that the call for public ownership of land in 1973's programme and the 1974 Manifesto for Development is still so relevant today. So too are the commitments on tackling wealth inequality. As we've seen, the 1974 Manifesto stated we should introduce an annual wealth tax on the rich, bring in a new tax on major transfers of personal wealth, heavily tax speculation in property, including a new tax on property companies, and seek to eliminate tax dodging across the whole field. This is the bold message we need today in a country riven with wealth inequality, a country where the top 1% have around 20% of all the wealth in the UK. Where wealth distribution is even more uneven than income distribution. The average wealth of someone in the top 1% is 5 million, while the latest figures from Credit Suisse in 2021 show that there are approximately 680,000 Britons in the richest 1%, and their total wealth is £2.8 trillion. In comparison, that's more than the wealth approximately 48 million Britons, 70% of the population of a total wealth of 2.4 billion. Figures out recently show that the wealth of UK billionaires is now at 684 billion, up 31 billion pounds in the last year. A billion's 1,000 million, by the way. The wealth is up by 400 billion pounds in just a decade. That's 400,000 million. Way lower today than in 2008 and have stagnated for a decade. These figures show what's happening. The share of the economy going to workers is going down, and the share of the economy going to the super rich is going up. While all the crisis in living standards, it's boom time for some. In this context, the 1973 programme and the 1974 Manifesto call for a wealth tax and for clampdowns on tax evasion by big corporations and the wealthiest individuals is more relevant than ever before. We still need a wealth tax on the super rich, in fact, more so than ever An annual, for example, of just 1.5% on all net wealth above £10 million would raise £15 billion per year, while an inflation matching pay rise for all nurses, for example, is around £1 billion. A wealth tax policy like that should be part of the programme that we push for today. In conclusion, the study of history is fascinating, but the application of its lessons to current and future challenges is essential. 50 years on to the very week from the publication of Labour's 1973 programme, as we hope to secure a Labour government in what cannot be objectively called anything other than a crisis in living standards, inequality in our public services, as we see and support trade unions fighting back, as we have to consider transforming our energy model so it's fit to meet the challenges of the day, as we hear those saying that the scale of the crisis means we will have to postpone what needs to be done, as we see a Tory party getting more and more right-wing with its legislative attacks on trade union rights and other essential democratic freedoms, the development of the 1973 programme and what followed when it wasn't fully implemented should give all of us in the labour and trade union movement cause for reflection. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Yeah, I think everyone will agree that there's a lot of food for thought and some very striking similarities with the situation today. I know that talking to people involved in the recent strikes across a whole lot of industries has just shown how threadbare, I was talking to someone from the NEU, whose daughter's had a geography teacher who was like at least one, and now they can't get one because people don't apply. There's a big shortage of maths teachers. Today at the picket line for St Mungo's workers who are out on strike at the moment, and they're having to use 3 agency workers to replace 1 striking worker because actually the services have been so under-resourced. And I think you've highlighted very clearly how the need for a bold programme that tackles that. I don't know if you've got any questions.